Um, we went through chapter 22 last time. Sorry, I got to look at this because I study out of a study Bible, and it's laid out different than the one I preach out of, and sometimes I lose my place where I started. So we got through chapter 22, and about to start chapter 23, and we're going to pick up with the end of the last verse of 22, because these two chapters, like much of Acts, runs together. You could have written this, or this could have been laid out with no chapters, and very easily could have been understood. Acts is just one of those books that's like that. Not all the books of the Bible are that way, but Acts is pretty much a continuation all the way through. There's a few places that differ, but not very many. But anyway, Paul is, as you remember, has ended his third missionary journey and has come back to Jerusalem and to observe the day of Pentecost. That has happened, and he got in trouble by going to the temple, and the Jews accuse him of all kinds of things, false accusations of all kinds, blasphemy being the number one, and accusation, and they accuse him of taking a Gentile into the inner court of the temple, which we know is not true. And so they bring him up on false charges before the Sanhedrin. And we see where the chief captain of the Romans basically saves Paul. We know it was God's intervention, not just man's, but this man took command of the troops and caused them to go in and rescue Paul before the Jews, as the Jews were beating him. Actually, he was being beaten. They were about to beat him to death. And so took him to the castle where they were going to imprison him, and Paul pulls his citizenship card on him, tells him that he's a Roman, tells him where he's from. And if you look at the map that we've got, Tarshish, where Paul was from, which was in Cilicia, was not in Israel, was not in Judah. It was north of Syria, in another country, if you will, another Roman province, but another country other than Israel. He was a Jew, for sure, and we're going to see tonight in chapter 23 where Paul says he was a Pharisee. He was part of the Sanhedrin at one time, because of his father. His father was. But part of the rules of the Roman Empire, because he was not a member, or was not born in Israel. He was born in Cilicia. He is truly Roman. He is a Roman citizen by birth. He's also a Jew by birth. So he has both citizenships. But his Roman citizenship that Paul uses to his advantage here, and will do so the rest of the book. Let's go to chapter 22, verse 30. On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. This is the chief captain of the Romans that it's talking about here. So he knows with certainty that the Jews would have killed Paul without his intervention. He's loosed Paul from custody, but not from custody, but from his bands. In other words, he's taking the chains off him. Remember when they first captured him and put him in double chains. They double chained him because they thought he was somebody, some serious criminal of some type. They didn't even know who he was. They didn't know what he had done. Just for safety purposes, they put him in chains just in case. Because in that day, the Romans had not seen the Jews act in such a manner unless it was somebody who was a murderer or a someone who had committed some serious crime. Remember the last time, well, not really the last time, because we've seen them act this way at the temple with Peter and John. There was a chief captain that rescued them. They also acted up this way with our Lord just before his crucifixion. So it's always in recent times in the Scripture, in a way, it's always been something to do with Christianity that we see, but historically it was always because of some serious criminal matter. And whatever it was, the Romans would step in, and usually it was a crime that would have offended the Roman law also, not just the Jewish law. And we'll see a little bit about that in this chapter. Chapter 23, verse 1, and Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Now, Paul refers to them as men and brethren. He's not referring to them as his Christian brethren. Remember that. These are the Sanhedrin. These are his Jewish brethren. There's a difference. And Paul, being a good Jew, and we see this in his writings, even in his epistles, where he oftentimes refers to the Jews, the unsaved Jews, the non-believers in Christ, as his Jewish brethren. So that's what he's referring to them here as. I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. In other words, I've kept the faith. I've lived a godly life up until this day. I've not done anything ungodly that I know of. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. This was a sign that he had spoken blasphemy. That's when the high priest commanded someone to when they had someone standing before them testifying in defense of themselves, one of the things they did is if the man or woman, whoever it was, spoke blasphemy, they were to strike them in the mouth. It was a way of cleansing their speech, if you will, of blasphemy. It was a sign that they used. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee. Thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? So they struck him because he spoke of the Lord, because he spoke of God. So they struck him in contrary to the law, he says, because he spoke of God is why they struck him. But they weren't supposed to do that. That's against their own law. They were not to strike a man who spoke of God. And they stood by said, they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Paul didn't know this was the high priest, is what he says. And the law was that they were not to speak evil. That was in the Jewish law, that they were not to speak evil of their rulers, especially the high priest. Remember, the high priest was supposed to be God's man. In this case, he's not, but he was supposed to be. I don't really understand why Paul didn't know Ananias was not the high priest, because in their day and even today with the priest and of the Jews, the high priest, you can tell who he is by the way he's dressed. Unless this happened and the high priest was not in his normal attire for whatever reason. I don't know. But for whatever reason, Paul doesn't recognize him. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead I am called in question. The Sadducees and Pharisees, remember them from Jesus' day in the Gospels? Two different sects of Jews, two different theological thoughts. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe the Messiah was going to die and be resurrected. They didn't believe that there was, I don't remember, there were some other things that they disagreed on, but that was the big one. And that's the one that Paul brings up here. And remember, like I said, Paul tells them here that he's a Pharisee. From what my understanding on this, you were born into that. His son, he was the son of a Pharisee. His father was a Pharisee. He was born into it. He was trained in it. It's a lifetime appointment. I don't know. I'm sure there was some way, possibly, that you could lose that appointment, but I don't know what it was. But obviously, Paul hasn't lost it. He still claims to be a Pharisee. Now, maybe in their eyes, because he has converted to Christianity and has become a blasphemous man, that maybe in their eyes they don't see it that way. Maybe that's the disqualifying factor for them. But according to the law, Paul is still a Pharisee. He's called into question over the hope of the resurrection because he believes in the resurrection of the Messiah. The Sadducees didn't believe that. So what's he done? He's played them against each other. Spoke the truth. He hasn't lied. He's told the truth. And in verse 7 he says, when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. They're ready to fight now, fight each other. What's the best way to conquer an enemy? If you can get them to fight each other, and you don't have to fight them yourself, that's the best way. And even though Paul looks as though he's sided with the Pharisees, even though he really hasn't, he's pitted them against each other. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees part arose and strove, saying, We find no evil in this man. For if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Now, pretty wise statement there. Let us not fight against God. They recognize, the Pharisees anyway, the scribes, which were the writers of their books. They were the ones that did the translations. They are the ones that recorded things. They were, some say, were possibly the higher level of the sect of the Pharisees. They were the leaders of the Pharisees. Remember in Christ that he dealt with men called scribes also. The Pharisees and the Sadducees both had scribes. But the scribes of the Pharisees says we find no evil in this man. Why? Because he sided with them. They're not even looking at the whole picture. They're not even looking at he's speaking of Christ. If they were, they wouldn't have said what they said. But all of a sudden now they're on Paul's side. And he says, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. So in other words, if he's gotten word from God directly, they're thinking he's a prophet. That's the only people that would have gotten word directly from God would have been a prophet. If he's gotten word from God, let's leave him alone. Let's don't fight against God. We don't want that. The world today thinks about that. Even worldly people, they don't want to fight. The ones that will admit that they think there's a God, they don't want to fight against God, in their own minds anyway. Now, you talk to them about the sinful life that they lead, and how that's against God. You can't get them to admit that. But when you mention to them that, well, what you're doing is against God, they're like, oh, no, I'm not, I wouldn't do nothing against God. You know what you hear? But they do. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down. Paul's they're tugging on him. They're one group's wanting him, the other group's wanting him, and one's wanting to save his life, the other one's wanting to kill him. The chief captain goes in and pulls him out, and to take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle. So he sends some troops in, and they take him out by force and take him back to the castle, to the dungeon. And now begins the section here where the Jews are going to plan to kill Paul. Now, they've already openly admitted they want to kill him, but now it turns very serious now. And it says, in the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." So now Paul has a promise from the Lord. He's at least going to live long enough to get to Rome. He knows that now. And reading through the rest of this, you see where Paul has a boldness about him now that he didn't have before, because he knows his time's coming. His death is coming, but he knows it's not going to be till after he gets to Rome. So what he does between now and the time that he goes to Rome, he's very bold in his speech. He's very bold in his actions. And basically, he don't care what they do to him, because he knows the Lord's going to protect him. And as children of God, now you can't be stupid about it, of course, but isn't that how we should normally live our lives? Is the Lord's going to protect us. And that doesn't mean that we go out here and run in front of a car. But as far as our dealings with the world, we should have a boldness that, not that we don't care type attitude, but an attitude that it doesn't matter what they do, God's either going to protect me or he's going to take me home type of attitude. And we've seen that with a few people, you don't see it much, as much as you used to, I don't think. But every once in a while you come across one of the Lord's saints that live that way. Now, verse 12, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. They make a pact, they make a vow that they're going to, before they eat or drink again, they're going to kill Paul. A very wicked group of people. And remember, these are Jews. These are supposed to be God's people. Or so they say they are. If you read carefully into what we've been talking about here, not just what we see here, what you see at the trial of Christ, and at the times that Peter and John and some of the others were brought to trial. The trials, this is more than once that Paul has been brought before them. The Jews are anything but God's people at this time. It's obvious. They're not gracious. They're not merciful at all. All they want is death. That's all they're seeking is death. And it's always death to God's people. And they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy. So there's 40 men who are banded together and have made this curse. And they came to the chief priest and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. They do this against the Sanhedrin and the chief priest himself. They didn't seek godly counsel, did they? They decided amongst themselves to do it. Now, therefore, ye with the counsel signifying to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though ye would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him. In other words, they're going to lie to the to the chief captain, and tell him that they want to question him again. They want the high priest to tell the chief captain, bring him to me tomorrow, we want to question him some more. But instead, they're not going to question him. When he comes, they're going to kill him. So they're going to lie to the chief captain. So here again, men who are supposed to be the godly leaders of the land are plotting. They're lying, cheating, stealing to kill a man of God, which the Pharisees have already admitted they think he's of God. The Sadducees haven't. But it's obvious that God's not a part of them. Now we know God predestined this to happen. I'm not saying that, but as far as they're concerned, these men are not of God. They're not believers. And when Paul's sister's son, his nephew, heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Paul's sister's son, his nephew, was there when this was all talked about. Why? Very possibly that he was a Pharisee too. Remember, his grandfather was. We don't know about his father. It doesn't tell us. It just talks about his sister's son. But very possible that this young man was one of the Pharisees also, and part of the Sanhedrin even. Like I said, it was in the family type of deal. So he goes and warns his uncle. Then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul the prisoner called me unto him and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee. Then the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, what is that thou hast to tell me? The chief captain, knowing the severity of the situation. This chief captain's a pretty smart guy. You notice when he finds out, as soon as he finds out Paul's a Roman citizen, his attitude changes towards Paul. He's ready to defend a Roman citizen, even against the rulers of the land of Israel. And he shows more mercy than the Jews do, than the Sanhedrin. He wants to hear both sides of the story. He's heard their side. Now he wants to hear Paul's side, and he's willing to defend Paul, all because he's a Roman citizen. Not because he's a Christian, but because he's a Roman citizen. Paul's nephew tells him, and he said, the Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly. But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from thee. So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him, see thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me. There's talking about this chief captain being a smart man. Here's another point: is he protected this young man. You know, if he'd have told everybody where he got his information, this young man probably would have lost his life. He'd have been killed, just like they would have wanted to kill Paul. And but he protects him. He tells him, "Don't tell anybody you've come and told me this." And the chief captain, as far as we know, didn't tell anybody about it either. He just quickly sends Paul away to safety. And he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, at the 3rd hour of the night. So remember, their night was started at 6 p.m. So this had been at 9 p.m. at night. And if this was in the spring, remember the Pentecost has just happened. 9 o'clock at night, it's probably still dark at that, or it has already become dark at that time. It would have been later in the summer before it would have been daylight at that time, depending on if they observed daylight savings time or not. But, of course, they didn't. But notice this captain of the chief captain calls up. There's 200 soldiers, 70 that's 70 cavalry, and 200 spearmen. So that's 470 men. He could have easily taken on those 40 men and killed them, but he didn't. Why? Because this was a critical time in Israel. The Jews were very close to an outright uprising at this time, and this man recognized that. And if you ever get an opportunity to read some of the history, some extra biblical history of that time period, but some say that the writer Josephus is probably one of the best ones to read. I've got his book at home. I haven't read all of it, but there was a time in Israel around this time, and what brought about the things that happened in 70 A.D., which would have happened after Paul's death, of course. But the Jews were on the verge of an uprising, partially of their own making, partially because of their own making of their hatred for the Romans, but also a big part of it now is Christianity. The Jews have begun, and it'll get even worse, begin torturing and martyring Christians. Remember, that's what Paul's job was before the Lord saved him. That whole part of the world will soon be in upheaval because of it, and the Romans will come in and destroy Jerusalem because of it, and the Jews will be defeated, and basically because of their rebellion against the Lord. Anyway, he's preparing these troops to go to Caesarea in the middle of the night. That's not like them either. They would normally send troops in the middle of the day. It's harder to defend yourself at night, and this is very dangerous territory. Verse 24, and provide them beasts that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. He's going to send Paul to the governor. The governor of what they referred to, some refer to as Palestine, some referred to as Israel still, but the Romans in particular began calling that part of what was known as Israel as Palestine. Not Palestine, not like the Palestinians. Don't get confused there. The difference between Palestine and Palestinian is kind of like the difference between Nazarite and Nazarene. That's kind of the comparison if you want to look at it that way. Palestinians have never had a country. Palestine was never an official country. It was a province of Rome and some other world powers down through the years. Verse 25, and he wrote a letter after this manner. So the chief captain writes a letter to Felix the governor. Claudius Lysias, under the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greetings. So now we have a name to go with this chief captain. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. Remember I told you this man is a very intelligent man. When we see that in his letter here, he tells Felix in his letter, here's this man that he's a Roman, for one, brings that out first thing. That's why he rescued him when he found that out. But because he'd been accused of the Jews, the custom was that he was to go before the Jews' council and be tried by their council. And then if it was a charge worthy of death, the Romans would approve it or disapprove it, whichever they agreed to. They compared not just the Roman law, but the Jewish law. If he had broken the Jewish law and it was a charge unto death, more than likely the Roman, this chief captain, who seems to have been in charge in Jerusalem at the time, would have approved it or not approved it. But to keep peace, that was the way they kept peace. And we think of all this going on in Jerusalem, but this is how the Romans ruled their whole empire. The different countries they had conquered, they let the religious leaders of that country continue on with their rules and regulations, whatever their law was, as long as it didn't supersede Roman law. But he says here, whom I perceive to be accused of questions of their law. In other words, he thought the man, maybe he's done something wrong according to the Jewish law. So remember, everything we've seen so far, this chief captain's always there. So he was there through the whole trial of Paul's whole hearing, that when they brought forth the accusations against him, and when Paul defended himself, he was there. He heard the whole thing. And he says, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bonds. There was nothing that Paul had done that was worthy of death or imprisonment. That's why he saved him, because the Jews were going against Roman law. And not only Roman law, but against their own law. They were not even sticking to their own law. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him farewell. So, when he found out that from Paul's nephew that the Jews had made a vow, there was a group of Jews that made a vow to kill him, he sends Paul to Felix, and not just Paul, but he lets his accusers know, I'm sending Paul to Felix. You go take it up with the governor. You go present your case to the governor. He says, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. So Felix is going to get to hear both sides of it now. And we'll see that in the next chapter. Paul is taken to Caesarea. In the last few verses of this chapter, he says, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And Antipatris is not on our map, but it was where Caesarea is on the map, it was kind of a suburb, if you will, of Caesarea. If you look on I looked it up at home. If you look up the name on Google, it'll show you where it was and what's there now. It's very close to what's Tel Aviv now. It's a suburb, and it was over the years, with all the fighting that's gone on over there between different factions and all that, it's been a stronghold. There was a fort built there at one time It went back and forth between the Muslims and the Crusaders at one time. It's called by something else now that I couldn't pronounce. So anyway, this was a popular place at one time. On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was, and when he understood that he was from Cilicia, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So he's under house arrest in Herod's judgment hall. Not in the dungeon like we've seen in the past, but a little bit better living quarters, but not. He's still held captive. He's still held prisoner. And he's to wait there until his accusers come. Remember, the chief captain gave his accusers the opportunity to go and speak their piece before the governor. And we'll see that in the next chapter. His accusers, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, they all go to Caesarea and they speak before Felix, give him his testimony, and Paul gets to defend himself again. And we start to see, well, not really start, it's already started. Remember, Paul has already preached the gospel to the Sanhedrin and the chief priest. We saw that in chapter 22. Now he's going to get to speak the gospel to the governor, the Roman governor, Felix. And then when Felix, his appointment runs out, the next governor comes in, Festus. He gets to preach it again to the governor, the new governor, and will continue preaching the gospel as he goes from Caesarea to Rome, preaches the gospel all the way to Caesar. Like I said before, you've got to consider this, still consider his trip to Rome a missionary journey, because Paul continues to preach the gospel. They will come across people on this journey that they've met before. A lot of people they haven't. There will be, history tells us, there will be eventually churches organized out of this trip. So there are truly, this will truly be another missionary journey. So we'll stop there for now. I know it had been just a few months ago that we went through what we're about to go through with the governors and Herod and King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa. But we'll go through it again and look at it from a little bit different light this time. We're doing a study on the book of Acts and not necessarily on the life of Herod like we did before. So just bear with us, and we'll get through this. And we're only 3 or 4 chapters from the end of the book. 4 chapters from the end of the book. So very interesting times in what's left.